Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. A Burning Clue by E. Hoffman Price. Do you mean to say, demanded Claire Dennison of her newly widowed sister, Martha Jarvis, that the insurance company refuses to pay off simply because you can't prove that Jarvis died before 12 noon instead of sometime after that hour? That's exactly it, affirmed Martha, sighing wearily. You see, the premium hadn't been paid for some time. The extension expired at 12 noon of the very day that his latest playmate called with her pearl-handled light housekeeping pistol and demanded a showdown. With no insurance and the house mortgaged to the last shingle, I'm left absolutely broke. If that red-headed good-for-nothing hadn't become penitent a minute after she did the first good deed of her life, and then shot herself, it might prove that Jarvis died before noon, thought Claire. But she said to her sister, can't you find anyone who heard the shots? Not a soul. There's so much shrubbery around the house and it's so far from the street. And you know, a 25 automatic is hardly louder than the snapping of a stick. Claire, there's just no use. But we've got to figure it out, Mart, insisted Claire. Let's see. Old Aunt Julia says she left the house about 11:30 that morning. How did you know the time? The radio was announcing a domestic science lecture, and Jarvis said, shut the damn thing off. They checked the broadcasting station and got the time. She also remembered she had just loaded his pipe. That's it, over there. Claire followed her sister's gesture and saw a Turkish water pipe with its brass fittings and flexible stem nearly 2 yards long, coiled about the neck of the glass water jar. She told the coroner all about loading the pipe, resumed Martha, and how she came back, finding them both all dead, and the pipe turned over and a hole burned in the rug. Claire noted the clean-cut square hole burned through to the warp of the old Persian rug. How did that happen, she wondered. When that woman shot him, explained Martha, he had the pipe stem coiled about his wrist, like he always did. They'd been quarreling before Aunt Julia left. Anyway, she opened fire, and it didn't take much of a move on his part to pull the pipe off the table. The cake of charcoal that keeps the tobacco burning just ate its way into the rug. Claire's fingernails were turning from rose to dark brown from the smoke of her disregarded cigarette. Mart, she said finally, call Aunt Julia. I want to talk to her. For several days, Claire pondered on the elusive problem, but in vain. Good Lord, she exclaimed a dozen times over. Why couldn't one shot have stopped his watch, like in a story mystery? All those details, and not one thing to prove he died before noon. The deep brand of that last pipe stared up at her from the rug and mocked her. There was a record of the crime, but it was as vain as the fleeting, spiteful crack of that tiny, deadly pistol which no one had heard. But how to use it? Claire questioned old Aunt Julia over and over again, but the old woman recollected only irrelevant details. But finally, out of the confusion, Claire picked a bit of hope. She phoned her sister's lawyer. Mr. Cartwright, she said, bring the insurance adjuster and a copy of the testimony of the coroner's inquest. Yes, I have something up my sleeve. Please try anyway. Thank you. They called the following morning, Cartwright politely humoring a woman utterly hopeless of deriving any benefit from it, and Bartlett the adjuster courteous, suave, and determined that his company would not pay $50,000 on any policy that had expired, even if only by 5 minutes. Mr. Cartwright, began Claire, when did Aunt Julia turn off the radio the day Mr. Jarvis died? The lawyer consulted his file of testimony. At 11:32 a.m., he answered, and then to Bartlett, "Here it is." The adjuster nodded. "I'll accept that. It's official." "And according to the testimony," resumed Claire, "she set his pipe before him at practically the same time." "Right," admitted Cartwright. "But I don't see," protested the adjuster. "Just have patience, Mr. Bartlett," said Claire sweetly. "Oh yes, I forgot something. How long could Mr. Jarvis have lived after the shots were fired?" "Death was practically instantaneous. According to our doctors, he couldn't have lived over a minute, if that long," replied the adjuster, "but that's fine. Now, Aunt Julia," continued Claire, turning to the old woman who had entered in response to her ring, "prepare that pipe, just as you always did." "This is irrelevant," protested Bartlett. "We're not interested." "Oh, but you will be," enthused Claire as she smiled at his disgust. "Do step into the kitchen and watch." Bartlett swallowed his impatience. They all watched Aunt Julia put a square cake of charcoal on the gas burner and then shred a golden brown leaf of Persian tobacco, soak it in water and wring it dry. She molded it into a heap and placed it in the bowl of the pipe. Then, with the brass tongs, she picked up the glowing charcoal and laid it on the tobacco. "Take it out in front," directed Claire, "just where Mr. Jarvis was sitting." "Really interesting," began Bartlett ironically. "Still, might as well see it through," suggested the lawyer. They sat there, watching the film of white ash accumulate on the surface of the charcoal. Claire put the mouthpiece to her lips and drew deeply. The pipe gurgled and bubbled, and a tiny wisp of smoke left her lips. As the charcoal burned, the outer coating of ash fell away. "Do try it," invited Claire, offering the pipe stem. Both men hastily refused. Claire's glance shifted to the clock on the wall. She drew again, another tiny wisp of smoke. She coiled the flexible stem around her wrist. "The way they do in Cairo," she explained, with a triumphant glint in her eye, "like Mr. Jarvis did." "Mrs. Dennison," protested the impatient adjuster, "I can't see this is getting us anywhere." He rose as if to leave. "Oh, you don't? Well, Mr. Bartlett, it's about time to show you." She also rose to her feet. "Look out!" the men cried in warning, but too late. The flexible stem about her wrist dragged the pipe from the table. The glowing charcoal lay like a great living ruby on the Persian rug. They smelled the stench of burning wood. "Let it alone," commanded Claire sharply, as Cartwright seized the brass tongs. They glanced at her and at each other, and at Claire's sister, and shook their heads significantly. "Look," she insisted, ignoring their meaning glances. She saw them wince as a square of red-hot living fire perceptibly settled as the nap beneath it was consumed. The wanton destruction of that antique fabric had an almost horrible fascination for them. They saw the black, oily distillate from the wool rise up along the edge of the coal. Then the coal shifted again, sinking deeper. "Mrs. Dennison, are you in your right mind?" demanded Bartlett. "That rug is worth hundreds." "Not hundreds," retorted Claire. "Exactly $50,000. The adjuster stared speechless. Claire seized the brass tongs. There was a perceptible sigh of relief as she picked the hungry destroyer from that rich old rug, and then silence as they regarded the caked blackness that marked the burn. "Mr. Bartlett," began Claire, breaking the silence, "compare that burn with the one made when Mr. Jarvis was shot. As you may have noted, I smoked the pipe about 10 minutes before I overturned it. The size of the hole I burned will convince you that Jarvis could not have been smoking much longer when he overturned his pipe. The cake of charcoal diminishes about a quarter of an inch every 10 minutes. Try it." And she concluded, "You see, this rug is worth $50,000. "Guess you better pay off, Bartlett," exulted the lawyer. "You win," admitted the adjuster as he reached for his pen and a sheaf of papers. The Compliments of the Chief by Lincoln Steffens. The chief of police lay on the great leather-covered sofa in his office alone. He wasn't tired. His barber had shaved him and gone. The mail was attended to. Routine business was over for the day. It was pleasant to lie here this way, in his shirt sleeves, his collar, cuffs, and boots off, and be comfortable. Everything was all right, and for an hour until noon. The chief was not to be disturbed. A light tap at the door, and a sergeant came in on a smooth-moving little man with eyes sometimes light blue and innocent, sometimes dark blue and sharp. The chief knew no one else would enter then, so he did not look up. The sergeant showed a card, Mr. Wayland Morrison Ball. But the chief wouldn't read. Who is it, Mac? What does he want? It's a squeal, Chief, about a gold watch. Well, why don't I go to the detective bureau? Just read the name, Banker Ball. The chief rose to his feet, hastily pulled on his boots, put on his collar, cuffs, and snapped on his cravat, while the sergeant held the coat. When the chief had wound down into that, he went to a glass, buttoned up the uniform, touched his hair, and went to his roll-up desk. When he was seated, he leaned his head on his hand, put on a dreamy faraway look, and the sergeant nodded. All right, then, send him in, said the chief. And so Mr. Ball found him pondering and absorbed. The sergeant retired. Chief Riley? No answer. Mr. Riley, I believe. The chief nodded and waved the gentleman to a chair. A minute more of a brown study, and the chief pushed a button 3 times. A detective came in and stood beside the desk at attention, till the chief came out of his preoccupation. Where are the men who are working on that jewel robbery now? They are shadowing the thief along the waterfront. At this moment? At this moment. Well, you warn them that the thief will take the Pennsylvania ferry and buy tickets in Jersey City for Washington. Arrest him on this side. The man saluted and went out. The chief seemed satisfied that the case was disposed of. He rose, thought a moment more, and nodded approval. His hand was playing with the banker's card. His eyes happened to catch it, read it, then turned slowly up under his heavy brows at the banker, who had got up on his feet with the chief. Mr. Ball? Wayland Morrison Ball. Banker? 11th National Bank. Right, the chief said slowly, nodding his head. 11th National Bank. He went to the window, his back to the banker, then he came about, leaned against his desk. Did you ever get back, he said indifferently, the bonds? 3, I think, yes. 3 CB&Q stolen 2 years ago? No. Might just as well. They were negotiated in Chicago a week before you missed them, got into circulation, and were soon in reputable hands. The banker was amazed. That case had never been reported to the police. A detective agency was called in, and, though its men worked hard, they never got the slightest clue to the thief or the property till the railroad company's transfer clerk caught the bonds at dividend time. The boy made a full mistake, didn't he? Taking bonds? Asked the chief, still rather absently. Never stole again, I suppose. Why, we never knew who took them, the banker said. Do you mean to say the thief was an employee? Is an employee? He will never do it again, I think, the chief said. I should dismiss all thought of it. Take that chair. The chief sat down at his desk, leaned his head in his hand, but this time he set his eyes keenly on the banker's face, all alert and attention. Now he said, what is the trouble today? The banker had gathered himself and was taking the chair indicated. It was near the desk, and the light fell on the banker's face. The chief's was in the shadow. Robbed? Yes, of a gold watch given me by my father, and as a present from him, I treasure it beyond its true value. But the chief lifted his hand deprecatingly. Where were you, and how did it happen? I was crossing the bridge and... One moment, Mr. Ball. Which way were you going? From Brooklyn here. I hardly ever go to Brooklyn. What time did you reach the bridge? 11:55. I know that because I looked at my watch as I took the bridge car. That's how I know I lost it on the bridge. You see, when did you miss the watch? As I stepped off the car on this side. The car was crowded, ladies and gentlemen, and some workmen. The watch was taken from the chain, and the clasp and the chain was put back in place. This was last night? The banker was nodding affirmatively to each statement, and his eyes flattered the chief as he loved to be flattered, by astonishment and wonder shown as a child shows these emotions. Your name was on the case inside, and your father's? Yes. John Henry Ball to his son, Wayland Morrison Ball. December 3rd, 1879. It is a heavy hunting case Geneva watch. The chief got up and walked to the window. Everybody in the car, except the working people, was talking and laughing in the several groups. Chief Riley turned back, thinking again. Can you be in your office tomorrow at 12:30 o'clock? He asked at length. Yes. The watch will be delivered to you then. The banker knew how to behave in most of the crises of life, but he was uncomfortable now. He would have liked to ask some questions, to express some thanks, to praise the official a little frankly, but the chief seemed to be absorbed already in something else. So Mr. Ball stepped back, bowing. I shall be obliged, Chief Riley, for this service, I assure you. Good day. The chief dropped his head as if mechanically bowing, and the banker reached the door. It opened before him, and he went out to his carriage, which bore him swiftly away to his office. Max, said the chief when the sergeant returned to him. Who's working the bridge now? I don't know, unless it's the Keg Kelly mob. But no, you told them to haul off, didn't you? Yes. And after that, I warned the hen and chickens off. Maybe they've gone back? Send Thompson in. Thompson came hurrying up from court. He was a fat but clean man of 40, and he looked more like a thief than an actor, for his face, though square and smooth-shaven, was red and irregular, with small, damp pink eyes. His plain clothes were a bit tough in style. The chief eyed the detective up and down, slowly, angrily. Some of your friends on the bridge have been robbing a friend of mine, Banker Ball. A fine big gold watch with the man's name on it. Thompson moved uneasily from one foot to the other. He rolled his hat around his hand, and he hung his head. He glanced up swiftly twice as if he thought of an answer, but he made none. I want it, said the chief. I want you and the watch here at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. The detective went out. The chief pulled off his boots, coat and collar, and lay down on the lounge. When Thompson left the chief's office, he went down in the basement where half a dozen detectives were lounging about. He spoke to them, asking first the same question the chief put to the sergeant. Who is working the bridge? All offered suggestions, and Thompson discussed them with his friends. Then he walked down to the criminal court building, where his side partner, Tarney, was. Tarney was on the witness stand, so Thompson moved about among the lawyers in the courtroom. He spoke to each alone, earnestly inquiring first, then saying something emphatic. They all seemed to answer in about the same way. Each shook his head, lifted his hands helplessly, and then nodded. When Tarney was told to step down, Thompson drew him out into the corridor, and they held a long consultation, leaning up against a pillar. They whispered, speaking eagerly, then silent, then as enthusiastically again, till they separated. Tarney, following one clue, visited each courtroom in the building and walked with every likely lawyer he saw. He went out into the street and called on other criminal law firms in the neighborhood. Sometimes he met men on the sidewalk with whom he talked. Now and then he stepped into saloons, looked around, and either left with a shrug or jumped at some man to whisper to him. This part of his work done, Tarney spent the rest of the day dashing into and out of pawn shops. He never stayed long in a place, just long enough to say a few stern words, make a few gestures, and to write down the one word, Ball. The old man wants it, see? That was the only sentence he spoke aloud. Thompson went to the bridge. At the New York end he spoke to a man who stood idly watching the crowd, then to a policeman. Each told him something that interested him, and he went on across the bridge afoot, stopping twice on the way over to address ordinary-looking persons. At the Brooklyn end also he addressed men who knew him. A short, swift tour of the pawn shops in Lower Brooklyn, and he rode back to New York. He called at several saloons and a few more pawn shops. And the old man wants it back, was the way Thompson closed the interviews. At 5 minutes to 6, Tarney emerged from the crowd in 23rd Street and approached the southeast corner of 6th Avenue. A big policeman was standing there, but at sight of Tarney he moved off without a sign of recognition. The detective leaned against the corner. At 3 minutes to 6, Thompson arrived. They turned off at once to a restaurant, where Thompson led the way to a corner table, and taking the chair which commanded a view of the whole room, he sat down. Tarney sat opposite him. They ordered a course dinner with wine, and saying nothing, ate it. Over the cigars they exchanged a few words. Been to the Hen and Chickens? Thompson asked. Nope. Everywhere else. Left that till tonight. You stop at Kelly's? Nope. No use till tonight. It was 8 o'clock when Thompson, walking alone in the shadows of the tenements on a dark side street, turned suddenly into a noisy saloon. He pushed open the swinging fly doors and stood still between them, holding off a wing in each hand. The room was full of men, some at tables, others at the bar, others again in a back room. All stopped whatever they were doing and looked at Thompson. There was silence. They stared, and half-raised glasses were put down on the bar. The bartender was the first to recover. "'Lo, Tom," he said. "Have something?" A man in the back room went quickly out of the side door. Another followed him slowly. "Keg here?" Thompson asked. "Yes," said a voice, and a short, well-dressed man came out of the back room. His face was hard, though the skin was soft and pale, and his hands were long and very fine. "Want me?" he asked. Thompson came in and let the door swing shut. "No, I don't want nobody," the detective said, smiling a little. The whole atmosphere of the room changed. The crowd relaxed. Interrupted drinks were swallowed and liquor flowed. Everybody laughed. "Come here," said Thompson. He caught Keg Kelly by a buttonhole and drew him into the corner, and Thompson talked for 1 minute with great firmness. "And the old man wants it back again," he said at last. "Good night." The next morning at 9 o'clock, Thompson stood on the corner of Mott Street in Houston, Tarney at Mott and Bleecker, with the rear entrance of the police headquarters between them. They seemed to be holding receptions. Queer old foreigners, dilapidated loafers, sports, out-and-out toughs, went up to them one at a time. Most of them made apologetic gestures or cursed and slunk away. A few smiled, spoke a few words, and delivered small parcels. The detectives left the corner simultaneously, and approaching police headquarters, went together down into the basement. There they looked over the stuff, as they called it, 11 watches of all sizes and shapes. Thompson took off Tarney's hat and held it out while Tarney put his watches in. Then he gave it to Tarney while he unloaded. "Wall," he said. "Microwitz wasn't sure of the name. Take it back to him." Tarney put it in his pocket. "Ball, maybe that's it," said Thompson, looking at the next watch, "but it's pretty small. I'll let the old man see it." He kept that. "And here's another ball. I guess that's it. Cag sent both of these buttes, ain't it? Here's a call. Take it and this too." "Wall?" "Say, here's a haul." "It's a haul sure enough. Regular poem." "What's this? Another haul?" "Those other little ones are no good. Keep 'em. I'll let the old man take his pick of these 2 balls. But I guess this big fellow is the one he passed the word for." Mr. Wayland Morrison Ball had a few friends in to lunch with him in his office at noon that day. He had promised to show them something interesting, and had explained enough to make them all very much interested to hear more. They looked at the clock when they came in. "Exactly 12:20, he said. Mr. Ball repeated on the minute. "He's a remarkable man. Why, I tell you, he told me things I didn't know myself. Who were in the car, what they did, which ones sang, which ones talked, and—" A shrewd little broker smiled. "Well, he did," Mr. Ball insisted. "He even described how the watch was taken off the chain exactly. And that other case of ours here, you know, he asked me about that, but he thought I knew more than I did. He knows who took the bonds." Mr. Ball lowered his voice. "And we don't know that to this day. He told me what the thief did with them, where they went, through whose hands they passed. It was a most astonishing thing." The bankers and brokers didn't half believe Ball. They ate of the lunch, drank a sip of tea or water or wine, and glanced up at the clock. Some of them tried to tell detective stories they had read, but Ball said such tales were all rot. "This is the real thing," he insisted. "Chief Riley, you ought to have seen the way he looked at me, and the questions he asked. Sharp, keen. He's a wonderful man. Wonderful. Everything right to the point, every word, every gesture, every glance." It was 12:20, and everybody knew it. They were silent, watching the clock or looking at their watches. Some of them stopped eating. The next 10 minutes dragged, but they passed. 12:25, 12:26, 27. The men were all nervous now and serious. At last it was 12:28. There was no sign, and Mr. Ball was anxious. But he smiled confidently. "It isn't time yet," he said. A minute more crept by. You could hear the clock tick above the ticker. The long hand on the clock moved on slowly till it was again the figure 6. Not a sign. It was over the 6. A rap at the door. Everybody started, and the company laid down their napkins to look, but remembered and turned their eyes away. "Come in," said Mr. Ball, raising expectantly. Two men, gentlemen, to see you." "Show them in." The clerk slipped aside. Thompson and Tarney entered side by side, as solemn as undertakers. "Mr. Ball," said Thompson, looking at the banker. "I'm Mr. Ball." "The compliments of Chief Riley," the detective said. He laid the watch on the table. Then he and Tarney turned and went out. The watch lay there on the table, every eye fixed upon it. No one moved. The gentlemen glanced around at one another, then up at their host. Mr. Ball smiled a little, rather proudly. The Confession by Maurice Level. I stood still for a moment before the open door, hesitating, and it was only when the old woman who had been sent to bring me said for the second time, "It is here," that I went in. At first I could see nothing but the lamp screened by a low drawn shade. Then I distinguished on the walls the motionless shadow of a recumbent body, long and thin with sharp features. A vague odor of ether floated around me. But for the sound of the rain beating on the slates of the roof, and the dull howling of the wind in the empty chimney, the silence was deathlike. "Monsieur," said the old woman gently, as she bent over what I now saw was a bed. "Monsieur, the gentleman you asked for is here." The shadow raised itself, and a faint voice said, "Very well. Leave us, madame." When she had shut the door after her, the voice went on. "Come near, monsieur. I'm almost blind. I have a buzzing in my ears, and I hear very badly. Here, quite close to me there, ought to be a chair. Pardon me for having sent for you, but I have something very grave to tell you." The eyes in the face that craned towards me were wide open in a sort of stare, and he trembled as he faltered. "But first, are you Monsieur Genoux? Am I speaking to Monsieur Genoux, leader of the bar?" "Yes." He sighed, as if with relief. "And at last I can make my confession. I signed my letter Pierre, but that is not my real name. It is possible that if death, so near me now, had not already changed my face, you might vaguely recognize me, but no matter. Some years ago, many long years, I was public prosecutor for the Republic. I was one of the men of whom people say, he has a brilliant future before him, and I resolved to have one. I only needed a chance to prove my ability. A case at the Assize gave me that chance. It was in a small town. The crime was one that would not have attracted much attention in Paris, but there it aroused passionate interest, and as I listened to the reading of the accusation, I saw there would be a big struggle. The evidence against the prisoner was of the gravest nature, but it lacked a determining factor that will frequently draw a confession from the criminal, or the equivalent of a confession. The man made a desperate defense. A feeling of doubt, almost of sympathy, ran through the court, and you know how great the power of that feeling is. But such influences do not affect the magistrate. I answered all the denials by bringing forward facts that made a strong chain of circumstantial evidence. I turned the life of the man inside out and revealed all his weak points and wrongdoings. I gave the jury a vivid description of the crime. And, as a hound leads their hunters to the quarry, I ended up by pointing to the accused as a criminal. Counsel for the defense answered my arguments, did his best to fight me, but it was useless. I had asked for the head of the man. I got it. Any sympathy I might have felt for the prisoner was quickly stifled by pride in my own eloquence. The condemnation was both the victory of the law and a great personal triumph for me. I saw the man again on the morning of the execution. I went to watch them wake him and prepare him for the scaffold, and as I looked at his inscrutable face, I was suddenly seized with an anguish of mind. Every detail of that sinister hour is still fresh in my memory. He showed no sign of revolt while they bound his arms and shackled his legs. I dare not look at him. for I felt his eyes were fixed on me with an expression of superhuman calm. As he came out of the prison door and faced the guillotine, he cried twice, "I am innocent!" And the crowds that had been prepared to hiss him suddenly became silent. Then he turned to me and said, "Watch me die. It will be well worth your while." He embraced the priest and his lawyer. He then placed himself unaided on the plank and never flinched during the eternal moment of waiting for the knife. I stood there with my head uncovered, but I did not see, having for the moment lost all consciousness of external things. During the days that followed, my thoughts were too confused for me to understand clearly why I was full of some trouble that seemed to paralyze me. My mind had become obsessed by the death of this man. My colleague said to me, "It is like that the first time." I believed them, but gradually I became aware that there was a definite reason for my preoccupation: doubt. From the moment I realized this, I had no peace of mind. Think of what a magistrate must feel when, after having caused a man to be beheaded, he begins asking himself, suppose, after all, he were not guilty? I fought with all my strength against the idea, trying to convince myself that it was impossible, absurd. I appealed to all that is balanced and logical in my brain and mind, but my reasonings were always cut short by the question, what real proof was there? Then I would think of the last moments of the criminal, would see his calm eyes, would hear his voice. This vision of the scaffold was in my mind one day, when someone said to me, "How well he defended himself. It is a wonder he did not get off." Upon my word, if I had not heard your address to the court, I should be inclined to think he was innocent. And so the magic of words, the force of my will to succeed, were what had quieted the hesitation of this man, as they had probably triumphed over those of the jury. I alone had been the cause of his death, and if he were innocent, I alone was responsible for the monstrous crime of his execution. A man does not accuse himself in this way without trying to put up some sort of defense, without doing something to absolve his conscience, and in order to deliver myself from these paralyzing doubts, I went over the case again. While I reread my notes and examined my documents, my conviction became the same as before. But there were my notes, my documents, the work of my probably prejudiced mind, out of my will enslaved by my desire, my need to find him guilty. I studied the other point of view, the question put to the accused and his answers, the evidence of the witnesses, to be quite sure about some points that had never been very clear. I examined carefully the place where the crime had been committed, the plan of the streets near the house. I took in my hands the weapon the murderer had used. I found new witnesses who had been left out or neglected, and by the time I had gone over all these details 20 times, I had come to the definite conclusion, now not to be shaken, that the man was innocent. And as if to crown my remorse, a brilliant rise in position was offered me. I was very cowardly, monsieur, for I believed I did enough in tending my resignation without assigning any reason for it. I traveled. Alas, forgetfulness does not lie at the end of long roads. To do something to expiate the irreparable wrong I had caused became my only desire in life. But the man was a vagabond, without family, without friends. There was one thing I could have done, the only worthy thing. I could have confessed my mistake. I had not the courage to do it. I was afraid of the anger, the scorn of my colleagues. Finally, I decided that I would try to atone by using my fortune to relieve those who were in great trouble, above all to help those who were guilty, who had a better right than I to try to prevent men being condemned. I turned my back on all the joys of life, renounced all comfort and ease, took no rest. Forgotten by everyone, I have lived in solitude and aged prematurely. I reduced the needs of life to a minimum. For months I have lodged in this attic, and it is here I contracted the illness of which I am dying. I shall die here. I wish to die here. And now, monsieur, I have come to what I want to ask you. His voice became so low, I had to watch his trembling lips to help myself to understand his words. I do not wish this story to die with me. I want you to make it known as a lesson for those whose duty it is to punish with justice, and not because they are there to punish in any case, I wanted to help bring the specter of the irreparable before the public prosecutor when it is his duty to ask for condemnation. I will do as you ask, I assured him. His face was livid and his hand shook as he gasped. But that is not all. I still have some money that I have not yet had time to distribute among those who have been unfortunate. It is there in that chest of drawers. I want you to give it to them when I am gone, not in my name, but in that of the man who was executed because of my mistake 30 years ago. Give it to them in the name of Rene. I started. Rene? But it was I who defended him. I was. He bowed his head. I know. That is why I asked you to come. It was to you I owed this confession. I am Daru, the public prosecutor. He tried to lift his arms toward the ceiling, murmuring, Rene, Rene. Did I betray a professional secret? Was I guilty of a breach of rules that ought to be binding? The pitiful spectacle of this dying man drew the truth from me in spite of myself. Monsieur Deroux, Rene was guilty. He confessed it as he went to the scaffold. He told me when he bid me goodbye there. But he had already fallen back on the pillow. I've always tried to believe that he heard me.